Welcome back to another week of the Untrained podcast. And this is not where we celebrate being untrained, but we recognize a God who's able to use us in spite of the fact that we're untrained. Because ultimately, it is about God being able to use anyone who's willing. And we are in our second last week of our readings, or just finished our second last week of our readings. One more week to go. We're there, man. Yeah. One more week.
It's been a journey.
It's been awesome. And so we're up to the crucifixion. And for the Christian, this is everything.
Yeah.
This is our ticket to heaven. This is justification. Our substitute, God himself.
And like we said a few weeks ago, the majority of the book of Mark is devoted to the final events, the closing scenes of Jesus' life. And so even just the emphasis in terms of percentage alone in Mark, it shows us how significant this whole theme of crucifixion and death
It's all just been building. First, it was, all right, let me try convince my people of who I am.
Yeah.
And they know who he is and they've rejected him. All right, well, let me try convince these other guys, my disciples, of who I am. And they got challenges and challenges and challenges. But in spite of those challenges, they're kind of still around. And even though when there's an opportunity to leave, they're not taking those opportunities, and they're not rejecting him. They're just struggling to understand. And so finally they get to the point where they're like, oh, you're the Christ. He's like, yes. Yeah. And then he pivots. Now that you get who I am, this is what I need to do. I need to die, and on the third day I'll rise again. I'm going to die, and on the third, no. And he's just combating.
They're willing to follow Jesus up to a certain point.
Yeah.
And when the point, I guess, it conflicts with their narrative, then they push back.
Yeah.
And you made a really good point last week about the fact that in their rejection of what Jesus is saying, they're rejecting prophecy and they're rejecting the word.
Yeah.
And this is rebellion against what God has said. And it's no doubt as to why they have the experiences that they have in those moments in the garden and they run away. It's because they haven't been willing to receive what God's ordained will was. And so they've set themselves against him.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. And so everything Jesus has been teaching them is to prepare them for this of what we're about to read. So last week, Judas betrayed him. He's been taken.
We see a naked man and we finish on that naked man. You have any ideas as to who that is now?
Nothing. I still got nothing. I still just got those question marks near that passage.
You know, like when people ask you questions in Bible studies and they're like, so they ask you some like question that there's no answer in scripture to.
Did Adam and Eve have belly buttons?
Like, when we get to heaven, we'll find out. So it's just one of those questions.
Yeah, that it is for me. It is for me. It'll be so fascinating if we get to heaven and turns out this is actually such a crucial piece of the puzzle that we've just been missing. Yeah. But anyway, we're going to kick it off this week we're still in chapter 14. Chapter 14 is a very big chapter.
Verse 53.
But we're starting, verse 53, where he comes before the council. Now, I think something that kind of jumped out at me, and it's not profound. It's not like, well, this is such an insightful point. But it's just an observation rather than interpretation. But it becomes very obvious that this is unplanned.
Yeah.
Right, so last week we kind of saw that they had a plan, but then that got scrapped because Judas came and gave him an opportunity.
Yeah.
And so now after they've captured him, they bring him before the council, but they can't get their story straight. And it becomes very obvious that that's not happening to the point where, Jesus is silent, but something I kind of wrote is like, why is Jesus silent throughout this whole kind of thing? And it's like, maybe it's just because they were actually making a case for him, not against him.
I was thinking the same. It's like, Jesus didn't say anything. Because they're just incriminating themselves. He doesn't need to say anything. Yeah. And he doesn't want to give them any material that they could then twist.
Exactly, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, it's fully a kangaroo court.
Yes.
Like it's a miscarriage of justice.
Yeah.
It's at nighttime, and because like it's thrown together at the last minute, that you probably don't have, everybody there that needs to be there. They haven't been fully informed. They don't even have witnesses.
The witnesses haven't been briefed.
It's fully just like hodgepodge.
Yeah,
and it just shows this is a miscarriage of justice from the very beginning to the very end, and yet Jesus says nothing to acquit himself.
Yeah, fully, and he could have just exposed it and that, but he lets it happen, and I just kind of want to read a couple of parts, right? So
let's do it.
So they brought him to the high priest.
Hey, just a quick question. Is this the first reference to the high priest that we've seen so far?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. I'd need to go back and read and remember, but I think it's possible. And so Peter's following at a distance, right?
As close as
and he
can
probably
get.
does feel a little bit better than the rest, because the rest are absolutely scattered somewhere in hiding.
Yeah.
And he's like, I did say I'd still be with him. I wonder how much in his mind he's like, told you I'd still be here.
I still have my clothes compared to the other guy.
Anyway, the Bible says very clearly in verse 55, it says, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death. Now, does that sound like an unbiased justice system?
Well, it's like, they're having the trial in order to find something against him.
Yeah. They haven't
that's
found
not how it
something
works.
and then it went to a trial.
It's supposed to be you have something and that's why you have the trial. And so, even from the very beginning, and it says, but they found none. They found nothing at all.
And here's the question I had, is if that happened to me, what would they find?
Oh, they probably find a lot.
You get what I mean? They would.
Yeah.
And so really kind of just highlights the kind of life Jesus actually lived. Not just what's recorded.
There was nothing.
What he actually lived.
The only thing that they could get on him is something that he said that they misinterpreted or misconstrued, It's interesting, bro. I found this contrast.
Yeah.
And remember in verse 50 where it says that all the disciples left him and fled?
Yes.
And then we come down to verse 53. It says, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And so you see this abandoning of Jesus by his followers.
That's a cool contrast.
But you see this uniting of the forces of evil.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the spirit has been withdrawn, and then Satan and his energies are just working in this way where it's a unifying way, where it's just bringing this scorn and this mocking upon the chosen one of God. And you see a lot of satanic fury over these next few passages of Scripture as to what Jesus is subjected to at the hands of sinful men.
Which is a good lesson in that, although unity is a good thing to aspire for, unity is not the definition of the right thing or the truth. You can be united for evil.
What we fully see in these next few chapters is mob rule, mob justice.
Yeah.
In its worst form.
And the Mark here in in verse 56, he says, many bore false witness against him. But then he says, but their testimony do not agree. And that's why I say, quite obviously, they didn't have the time to plan properly, right? And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy the temple. Which he actually did say that. Yeah. That is made with hands in 3 days, and I will build another, not made with hands. And it says, yet even about this, their testimony didn't agree. And I kind of chuckled in the morning when I was reading this. Yeah. And it was like, even about the parts that are actually true, they were not on the same page.
Even the parts that they were trying to use to get to Jesus, they couldn't.
Yeah, but it's like, but he did say this, right? But even then, the testimony didn't agree. Some were like, oh, he said something different. So, you know what I mean? Yeah. And so it's such a mess. And this fake trial with these fake witnesses is falling apart. And so the tactic changes. Yeah. Rather than let's get dirt from the outside, let's make him talk.
Let's asking questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the high priest stood up in the middle and says, have you no answer to make? And it's like, why would he? They've not built a case. Yeah. But he remains silent. And then again, the high priest asks him, and then I find this very fascinating. He wouldn't respond to a lie, but he does respond to a truth. He says, are you Christ, the Son of
the blessed? And he responds to a question that has to do with his identity and who he is. Now, you remember when Jesus tells the disciples, hey, don't tell anybody. Yeah. After Peter's confession, don't tell anybody. Yeah. Because he knows that when he reveals who he is, the consequence is going to be death. And so this question is asked him is like, well, I've drunk this cup. Yeah. And I'm going to continue to drink this cup. So it's all out. I'm fully going to declare not only who I am, but what I will be. You think that you're judging me? Yeah. I'm coming one day as judge, and I will judge you. And so he flips the table on them. And at what point do you kind of consider and say, maybe we're making a wrong decision here?
Well, I believe they knew they were. And I hadn't seen this before. But it goes to later on when he's on the cross. And it specifically says, when he cried out, it specifically says that they said, well,
Elijah.
Let's wait to see. So they're that shows that in their mind, they actually believe that it's possible that he is with God.
It's like this risk and reward. the risk is, like the reward is, he's not who he claims to be, and we made the right decision, or not endorsing them doing that for anybody, but they've made the right decision. Or the risk is he is who he says he is, and so they're accusing him of blasphemy. But if he is who he claims to be, the blessed one of God, then guess who's the blasphemer? They are.
And they believe it's possible.
Yeah.
Because, I don't expect any gift from Santa this Christmas.
That's good.
I haven't pretty much since forever. Why? Because I don't believe it. I don't believe he could, or let's see if he... The whole let's see if shows that I actually believe that it might be true. You know what I mean? So, with the fact that this might be Messiah, and yet you're doing this, shows that you don't actually care about Messiah at all. Because even if it's possibly him, you wouldn't ever touch it. But they cared so much about themselves and not about God. And their godliness was essentially just a form of getting to power.
Power and control. And, there's so many instances where Jesus had revealed to them unequivocally as to who he was and where he had come from and the power that was behind what he was doing with the miracles that he was performing. I preached this sermon and we see from the Gospel of John when Jesus is arrested in the garden, and there's a couple of instances where the miraculous is revealed, but they still arrest him. The first one is they say, Jesus comes forward and says, "Whom are you seeking?" When he comes forward to them, they fall down like they're dead.
Oh, yeah.
That doesn't happen to any ordinary person.
Yeah.
And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth," he says, "I am." They fall down dead. The second instance is they bind him. The third instance, they chop off that guy's ear, gets chopped off. He puts it back. Jesus puts it back on. But in between the guy's ear getting chopped off and Jesus healing the guy, he's bound. And so there's three miracles, they fall down as dead men. These are soldiers. The second one is Jesus heals a guy's ear. And the third one is that he was bound, but all of a sudden he's free. Not. And so there's multiple, experiences.
They know.
Even in the arrest that you shouldn't be doing this, but yet they persist in this path.
Here's the not the beautiful part, but the clear part of Mark is that very early on he revealed to us they know.
Yeah.
They know, but they don't care. They've hardened their heart.
Do you remember that parable that Jesus shared of the vineyard and the tenants?
Yeah, this is what's happening.
And it's they see the son coming. They're like, hey, here comes it. They knew it was the son.
Yeah.
Here comes the son. Let's kill him and we'll get the vineyard. We'll get the inheritance for ourselves. And so when you consider it from that angle, who's the one committing blasphemy here?
Yes, they are.
Fully. And so there will come a day where the judgment will be laid square at them.
Yeah.
And sorry, I'm just jumping in here. In verse 62, when they ask him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus' response is, "I am."
Yeah.
I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.
And it's so funny or fake how in 64, "You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?" It's we were told that they were there to find a way to make sure he's guilty.
Yeah.
What is your decision? How sincere is that? It's whatever.
It's they're accusing Jesus of breaking the Sabbath and all this kind of stuff while they're lying and breaking the 10 Commandments to try to get him.
Exactly.
It's come on, can't you see the irony in this? It's they're breaking the law, but Jesus is keeping the law. And they're trying to get him for,
Exactly. And so they all condemned him, saying he's deserving of death. Now, I highlighted this because according to the Jewish law, there's a very specific type of death that the law demands. And it's the death of stoning.
Yeah.
People who blaspheme, and this is true in Old Testament times, people who blaspheme, they were guilty and needed to die via stoning. And they know this. We see this in John chapter 10, verse 30, where Jesus says, "The Father and I are one." And then verse 31 says they pick up stones to stone him. He says, "For what good work do you stone me? For many good works I've done, for which of those do you stone me?" They're for none of them, for blasphemy. So they knew.
Yeah,
you hear blasphemy, you stone.
Can I make a point on that? You see another example with Stephen stoning.
Yes.
And why did he get stoned? Because he said, "I see Jesus, at the right hand." Exactly what Jesus said.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they know that what he needs is stoning. But they don't want to stone him. And I think that's a really important point, right?
Yeah.
It's a really important point. Even if they believed what they were saying, then they would have stoned him.
Yeah.
But by the very fact that they're calling it blasphemy, but they're not killing him and going to Pilate to try and get him crucified on a tree, shows that they're not actually trying to follow anything. They're just trying to find a way to destroy this man.
And the significance of the tree is what it communicates.
Yeah.
You know, in Jewish
Deuteronomy.
law, it's like any man who is cursed on a tree is cursed by God. And so they recognize the influence that Jesus has. And so if he was stoned to death, he would probably be perceived as a martyr.
Absolutely.
But if he's hanging upon a tree in a public way, he's accursed by God.
And this is why last week the point was highlighted to me of like, they weren't just fearful of Jesus, they were fearful of the people.
Yeah.
See, because they wanted by this not to just kill Jesus, because you can kill Jesus and the movement still continue. But how do you kill Jesus and end the movement?
Yeah.
And I read a story of in 70 AD, when the Romans came and ransacked Jerusalem. It was an absolutely bloody, gory moment in history where some historians say that there was like blood flowing. You know, the streets were like rivers of blood. Anyway, there's this one story from that of, I think it was 3 gentlemen who were in a room full of women and children. And the Roman guards came in and these 3 gentlemen attacked the guards. And it gave them enough time for the women and children to escape. And they did, and they got out to the city. Those 3 men were captured and then crucified. And in all Jewish history, no name will ever be mentioned of these names. And they've distanced themselves from these heroes because they're on a cross. Because the mindset is, if you're on a cross, God's cursed you, and we don't want to be associated with anything that God has cursed. And so...
And it's true in a sense, because Jesus was, because
what
he
they
took
were
the sins of the world.
Exactly. And this is kind of like that fascinating point that what they thought would destroy his mission was the very reason he came to accomplish.
It's like, let's get him on the cross. And Jesus, even before that, was saying, hey, I'm going to die on the cross, like years before. Like and it just shows you, and we brought this out last week, that Jesus is in control at every single step. Even when they feel as if, like, you see it when it says... it says they led Jesus, and throughout you see Jesus being led, like they're leading Jesus, they're moving Jesus on, they have control over Jesus. They ain't leading Jesus anywhere that he doesn't want to go.
Well, if there's any place in Scripture that shows this, and I actually get tremendous peace from this, I think we actually make a dangerous... Look, it's like most things. You got 2 ditches and they're both really bad. One ditch is... they belittle Satan as being no threat and who cares about him, and super trivialize Satan and in the great controversy. Yeah. And then you find themselves just being enslaved to him without knowing, right? Like they're not cautious, where Scripture does provide caution. But then you go to the other extreme, and I find this extreme to be more prevalent often, is that we magnify the power of Satan as though somehow it's going to take some crazy imaginary, like not imaginary, but this crazy miracle for God to be able to, and it just shows how dumb Satan is compared to God. And I love that idea. Satan is dumb in comparison to God because he thought he was destroying God's movement, and it's the very thing God was using to fulfill it. And God does this over and over and over again in the text.
And God's
the very thing Satan uses for evil, God uses to accomplish his will.
God's like, checkmate. Like,
every time.
Time after time. Yeah.
Every time. And we serve the one who knows the end from the beginning. Satan doesn't know the end from the beginning. And so God can anticipate anything and use it. And I think it's really important to understand. Is Satan smart compared to you? Yes. But what's he compared to God?
Yeah.
Dumb.
Yeah.
And I like calling him dumb. Anyway.
So, I mean, after they come to their decision, after Jesus says what he says, the high priest tears his robes.
Yep.
We don't need any more deliberations.
Yes.
You're condemned to death based upon what you've just said here. And then they spat on him, it says. Yep. They cover his face and they strike him. And they say, prophesy to us. And all the guards received him with blows. And so Jesus is, he's
copping a physical beating here.
Yeah.
And while this is happening,
here's Peter.
Faithful Peter. He's there with him in the courtyard.
And
I'm saying that sarcastically because as you keep reading, and I actually really appreciate that Scripture shows that it was a servant girl.
Yeah.
We know these days in our society that females have value. That is not how things functioned in that world.
Yeah.
And if you're a servant girl, you're the lowest of the lowest pretty much.
You're probably one of the bottom rungs on the ladder. Yeah.
Peter had no obligation to answer that type of person.
He was terrified of her. He was terrified of his
Terrified.
conscience.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And I think people, like, this is a really important lesson, is that when we know we're in the wrong, we're going to feel attacked. We're going to feel like everyone's cornering us, but it's not. Like, that is an act of mercy. Like, this is an act of mercy that God has on Peter, revealing to him and breaking him so that he doesn't become like Judas, where he's just hardened and executes without that conscience, without that hesitation. And so he's there by the fire, and a servant girl comes, and she's like, "You were also with that Nazarene Jesus." And then he lies.
Yeah. And the rooster crows.
Yeah. And then the servant girl comes back again, and she says to the bystanders,
Yeah.
"This is one of them." And he lies again. He denies it. But then the bystanders were like, "Certainly you're one of them. You're Galilean," which I'm curious how they know that he's a Galilean.
I think it says in another gospel, like, your speech betrays you.
So was it the accent? Was it, you know what I mean? I don't really, I know that, like, speech was, and I often kind of interpreted that as though, like, he speak properly, because in the next one, he was like, he'd use swear words and rough it up a bit, you know?
Fisherman language. Yeah.
And that's kind of what he does, except here in Mark, he kind of uses the curse in a very different way.
Curses on himself.
He invokes a curse on himself, and to swear, it's like, it's almost, I hate the phrase. I really don't like when people are like, "I swear to," and then they use God, right, in that.
Yeah.
And it's almost like he's doing that. Like, he's swearing an oath.
And we looked at this the other week, like when he emphatically says to Jesus, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And then it's like here it says he began to invoke a curse, like emphatically say, "I do not know this man of whom you speak."
So instead of emphatic, like, he was emphatically saying he won't, but then he emphatically did.
Just a complete roundabout.
Exactly. And then the rooster crows.
Yeah.
And he remembered.
Don't you think it's interesting that each and every time, like, he's denying Jesus, like, he's following Jesus from a distance, then he denies Jesus, and it says, and then he went out into the gateway. And so he gets as close as he can, but not too close that it would imperil his life. And then he kind of gets found out. And so he's like, okay, let's make that distance a little bit further. Yeah. And so the distance is getting further and further and further from Jesus with every subsequent kind of, I guess, denial of Jesus. Yeah. And it just shows you that if you want to follow Jesus, you got to be where Jesus is. You can't just follow from a distance. You got to be right where he is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really good point, man. And then he broke down and he wept. And this is that type of bitter weeping. And he realizes, I actually think this is the first time that he actually realizes how lost he is. Yeah. And I think this is a really important point. It might be a side step here, but on Facebook recently, I saw this post that a person who's in ministry wrote, and they were trying to say how, like, there's a place for coercion. And the example that they used, and they were saying that God coerces. And they were saying, well, look, if God says, you know, choose me or else, how's that not coercion? And so they were saying, like, coercion is fine as long as you're trying to coerce towards a good thing. And I didn't write this, but I really wanted to kind of get upset. And what really frustrated me about this is that whole paradigm is completely opposite to the gospel. Yeah. See, because the gospel, you've heard me share this story 1,000 times, but I'll share it again. If you lived in a really, really good neighborhood and your house is worth millions of dollars and there's a park that's really safe for kids and there's almost no crime rate, there's almost no drugs, you got beautiful views, it's a clean neighborhood, and then you get a newspaper delivered to you and it says that in the local council, they're having a meeting to determine whether or not they're going to build high-rise apartments in that park. They're going to replace that safe park with high-rise apartments for the homeless. How do you feel about that news?
It's going to drive the value of your place down.
So even if you're a Christian where you're telling yourself, well, this I'm kind of glad, you're still going to be thinking, oh, look at all I have to lose. However, if you're a homeless person and you're bin diving for some dinner, and you find an old newspaper that's been discarded, and you read that the local council's meeting to determine whether or not they're going to build a high-rise apartment in that area for the homeless, how do you feel?
Pretty stoked.
The problem is that most people have when they relate to the gospel is that they don't realize that we're the homeless man. We approach things as though we have something to lose. But what the Bible teaches us is that we know we don't. We don't have anything to lose. In fact, Jesus in John chapter 3, I think it's verse 18, he says he doesn't come to condemn the world. And then he tells us why. He says, because they're condemned already.
Yeah. From dust we came, and to dust we return.
We are, the default position is condemned when humanity fell. And then God enters. And he gives us free will. He gives us the ability to choose to be uncondemned. And do you see the different paradigm?
Yeah.
That's not coercion or else. It's you are in this situation and I'm giving you a choice out. We're not the people in the mansion with the big house that, oh, if we don't do this, we'll end up homeless. No. We're homeless.
Already.
And then he gives us a choice to not be.
And even those that have rejected him and have chosen another path, God even gives them the breath to breathe, the life to live.
Absolutely.
And it's all borrowed, but that can only be found in God.
Yes.
And so today is a probation time that you might choose whether you want to live or whether you don't.
Yes.
But it's your choice. There is no life outside of God.
Yes.
And Peter realizes at this moment what took him years to recognize.
And that was the point that I was getting at. I think this is the point that he realized what he is.
Yeah. And he sees it. He sees what Jesus saw along and what Jesus was trying to teach him, but he was unwilling to see that he could only learn through this terrible experience. And I think that's a sad reality that often we have to learn the hard way because we're not willing to learn when things are easier or when things are revealed to us. And we believe other things and we assume the best of ourselves when the reality is we're just like Peter. And in a similar situation, we probably would have done just the same.
Yeah. I feel like this is the moment. I feel up to this whole point, Peter has been trying to prove to Jesus what he can become.
Yeah.
And Jesus has been trying to get Peter to accept what he is.
Yeah.
And I think there is this real truth in the gospel message that the sins that we try hide, he can't hide for us.
Yeah.
But the sins we can surrender to him, he hides for us.
And not just what...
He can't hide what you're trying to hold on to. You got to let go of that. And this was, I think, the moment where Peter realizes how much there is that needs to be forgiven.
And when you were saying it's not just what Peter is, but he's also trying to reveal to Peter who he is.
Yeah.
Because when we see who Jesus is, we see who we truly are.
Absolutely.
And I think a reason why Peter, he had to go to this place is he was not willing to accept what Jesus was.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't willing to accept that. This was the ultimate conclusion for that. If
Absolutely.
you're not willing to accept me, then you're going to be offended by me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so this is how chapter 14 finishes. And then as soon as it's morning in chapter 15, verse 1, the chief priests held consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. Now I found this fascinating. They have found him guilty of blasphemy.
But the whole council wasn't there.
Council wasn't there. And now they're holding consultation. What should we do with him? You don't need to ask that question. The Bible's told us what.
Yeah.
But they devise a plan, and that plan leads them to Pilate.
Because they recognize that they need to get the sanction from the Roman authorities to condemn him to death.
Yeah. And so they come to Pilate, who is arguably the most powerful person in this region.
Yeah.
And so they need something from him. He's the one who holds the power. Yeah. And so they ask him to take on the case. And so Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you king of the Jews?"
Isn't it? It's a loaded question because obviously that was what they actually told him.
That's what they told Pilate, that he's...
And so the case shifts. Yeah. So before the Sanhedrin, the charge was blasphemy, which was religious. Now it's before Pilate. The charge is now changed from blasphemy to sedition.
Yes.
And so isn't that interesting? Like in a space of a few hours, we go from this, which is expedient for us, blasphemy here to condemn you. Okay, this is what we discussed, and we're very zealous for Caesar. And he's claiming to be king, so let's change the, and that Pilate's just like, this is nonsense. Like, I've been dealing with you guys all the time. You don't care about Caesar.
Exactly.
You know?
And he knows this, right? And Jesus says, you've said so. In other words, he said, I didn't. Like, that's his way of saying, I didn't say that. You said that.
Are you asking for, it's like, are you asking for yourself?
Yeah.
Or are you just asking what they've told you to say? Yeah.
It's like if you came to me like, hey, are you telling people you're the senior pastor? I'm like, you may have said that. But that's a way of saying no. You know what I mean? Like, no, of course. Like,
and again, Jesus doesn't give enough. He doesn't give much.
Yeah.
You know, he's silent. And as it says, as a lamb before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth.
And then I found it interesting here. It's like chief priests accused him of many things. So they're just adding. They're just trying to find anything, and they're adding to the caseload. And so Pilate asked him again, and he's like, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, and it's interesting that it says Pilate was amazed.
Because the reason Pilate was amazed is because, number one, he sees how ludicrous these charges are. He sees straight through it.
Absolutely.
And what amazes him is it's so obvious, and this guy won't even defend himself.
Yes. So probably what was happening is something pretty similar to what was happening the night before, where the accusations were kind of a defense for the accused.
Yeah.
And Pilate's seeing this. He's like, dude, none of this adds up. Yeah. None of this adds up. And Jesus is just letting it happen.
Yeah.
And Pilate was amazed. And something I kind of wrote here, which is something I really struggle with. And you know me, so you know I struggle with it. That sometimes silence says more than our answers.
Yeah.
And his silence was what amazed him. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think the silence impacted Pilate more than if Jesus just answered each objection.
And what happened from that point onwards? Pilate's trying to get Jesus off.
Yeah.
It's like,
and he's go. Sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, here we see Pilate. He's amazed by Jesus' lack of speech, and it's at this moment when he's amazed by Jesus not saying anything. He's just like, I need to get this guy off. And so he starts to think of instances. Okay, what about Barabbas? And he's trying to appease the crowd, because he sees there's something about this man. And we know in other Gospels, you know, his wife has a dream, and we know in the other Gospels he's trying to wash his hands. He's trying to get rid of Jesus so he doesn't have to make the decision.
Yes.
He's trying to preserve his position and save Jesus when he needs to make a decision whether he's going to condemn Jesus or whether he's going to, you know, I guess, throw himself under the bus, you know, ultimately. To do what's right or to do what's wrong. And he chooses, sadly, the latter of those two choices.
Well, I actually think his problem is that he doesn't make a choice.
Yeah.
He has the power to end it. He doesn't have to find a way. They came to him with this trial, and he can just say, no, go away.
He's the authority.
Go away. That's what Herod did.
Actually, I did a little
That's what Herod did. Herod was like, no, go away. But then he tried to find a way for the right thing to happen without being the one that makes the right thing happen.
He didn't want to be the fall guy. You know, it's interesting. When you look at Pilate's track record, he wasn't a nice bloke.
Yeah.
There were many instances where he actually resorted to blows, and he actually killed a number of people to get his own way. And so he had authority, and he had used the sword before to assert his authority. But in this instance here, like, I think it's a good point. Like, he's not willing to make a decision. He's wanting the circumstances to sort itself out.
Exactly. He's trying to orchestrate circumstances rather than take a stand for what he knows is right.
Yeah.
And what you see as the story goes on, it starts off with him having all the power and them coming to him for permission. And then it ends with the man who has the power begging the lame crowd, what do I do? You know what I mean? The power shifts. Why? Because step by step by step by step, rather than making a stand for what's right, he tries to orchestrate circumstances to lead him to what's right.
And Ellen White says, like in Desire of Ages, the crowd sees that weakness.
Yeah.
And when they see that weakness, they go in for the kill. And they just... And if he was strong from the outset, then it would have been no issue for him.
Wouldn't have been an issue.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have been an issue. And I think there's a really important lesson, and that is that it'll never be easier to stand up for God than now.
Yeah.
Whatever circumstances you try orchestrate for that husband of yours to kind of see it, or the wife, or your kids, or your boss, or, you know, just kind of hoping, the new merger, maybe they'll change this. Whatever it is, it'll make it harder and harder and harder and harder and harder as time goes on, to the point where you'll feel powerless, even though at the end of the story, does Pilate actually have all the same power that he had at the very beginning? Yeah.
He still makes the decision. That was his to make.
He still has all the authority and the power that he has, but it obviously seems that he doesn't feel like he has that power.
Well, this is the verse 15. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And so his desire was not to do what was right. His desire was to satisfy the crowd. And it reminds you of Herod. Remember, like John the Baptist?
Very much so.
You see these leaders that are in positions of influence but have no backbone. And they're willing to sear their conscience and condemn an innocent man because it's politically expedient for them to do so.
I wrote, Pilate does what he knows is wrong because the majority want what is wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, that's not leadership. That's not. And we can often find ourselves in the same trap, and you find this as a pastor, you can kind of get tempted.
Making everyone happy.
And you can't. There has to be what's right, what's wrong, and some won't be and some will be. And maybe sometimes you'll think what's right is actually wrong, but unless you actually make that kind of decision, you can't actually learn that. Do you know what I mean? That's why Ellen White actually has this really interesting quote that I tell people all the time. She says, it's better to make the wrong decision than to remain in the valley of decision.
Yeah.
Because when you make the wrong decision, you can quickly see that it's wrong and change your decision.
Yeah.
Whereas if you just stay in the valley of decision, you find yourself always ending up making the wrong choice, but you don't actually ever make the choice. The choice gets made for you.
Actually, not making a decision is still making a decision.
Yeah, very much so.
It's like when Jesus says, I wish that you were either hot or cold, because you're lukewarm, which means you haven't made any decision either in the affirmative. Yeah.
And just to affirm kind of this thing, I got a little bit confused in Mark's ordering events because he gets, First he offers Barabbas. Who do you want? There's Jesus who heals people.
Or there's Barabbas.
Or Barabbas. And something I found interesting is that according to like Bible scholars, and even in some Bible translations, Barabbas' first name was Jesus.
Yeah.
And so you got Jesus, Barabbas versus Jesus Christ, yeah?
Well, Barabbas means son of
a father.
Son of father.
Son, Abba, father. And so you got Jesus, son of a father, standing next to Jesus, son of the father.
Yeah.
And you just put them next to each other and the choice just seems so obvious. Obviously, Jesus, son of the father.
Yeah.
And yet they don't. They choose the other. And
it's like, here is Jesus who has given life. He's raised the dead to life. He's given sight to the blind. He's healed lepers. And here's this guy who's termed as who committed murder and insurrection. Like, here's this guy, and they're complete opposites.
The opposite.
And you see this exchange. And I think even in this window, what you see is Jesus, the Son of God, or Barabbas, the son of Abba, is like, which one do you want? And the one who is innocent is condemned, and the one who is guilty is set free. Yeah. And like, this is a bit of like just foreshadowing, I guess, the ultimate purposes of what Jesus' death on the cross is all about. The guilty one is set free while the innocent one is condemned. Like, this is what Jesus was wrestling with in the garden. This is what Jesus drank, that he could liberate the captives. Absolutely. He could set them free.
Absolutely.
And we see this as a little window, this whole idea of the exchange, substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus. The Passover lamb is here, and he's died in our place.
Great
in
point.
The story of Barabbas.
So they cry out, crucified him, that decision's made. But then over the page in verse 16, they take Jesus away, mock him, put him in the robe, beat him. And I'm thinking, why do this? Like, why would you do this after he's already been crucified? And you don't believe that he's guilty, right? Yeah. Pilate doesn't believe he's guilty. And we learn from the other Gospels, the chronology is actually a little bit different. This actually happens in most other Gospels before they cry out, crucify him. Yeah. And so, again, first of all, Pilate sees he's innocent. But rather than just calling it then and there, he's like, let me offer you a worse person and then this good Jesus, and you guys pick. And so create some circumstances for the right thing to happen without making the right decision.
And he's fully thinking they're going to choose,
fully
condemn Barabbas.
And then he beats him, hoping to strike pity of that's enough.
Yeah. Just whets their appetite.
And then he brings him back again, and they cry out, crucify him. And then what a coward. He's like, all right, I'll wash my hands off this.
Well, particularly because it actually says he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up.
He knew this, but he wanted the right thing to happen without making the right thing to happen. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us to learn, that often for the right thing to happen, you got to make the right choice.
Yeah.
And we want the right thing to happen without us making a stand. But God's calling people to make a stand. He's calling me to make a stand. He's calling you. And I think it's really important that we learn the lesson of Pilate, that the only way the right choice happens is by making the right choice.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, they laid him out and crucified Jesus. And so Jesus, man, from the upper room, just been feeling the separation of sin. And after all of this, and now he's being led out to finally.
And I want to make a quick point, and I think we'll close. I think we'll save the crucifixion for next week.
Okay.
Yeah, but Jesus is mocked, and as Jesus is being mocked here, he's led away from where he's being condemned by Pilate, and what we see is he actually goes before the whole battalion of soldiers. These are hardened criminals, not criminals, hardened soldiers. They've seen war, they've experienced bloodshed, and everyone's piling on. Full satanic fury and agency, and they're mocking Jesus. It's interesting, and I've said this before in the podcast, that it appears as if they're leading Jesus and they have authority over Jesus.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting that this whole Gospel of Mark, it begins with the authority of Jesus? Like, Jesus has authority. He's casting out demons. Like, he's doing all this.
It's good.
And at this moment,
it's good.
His authority is surrendered.
Yeah.
And we know that it's a surrendered authority. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have authority, but it's an authority that has been voluntarily surrendered for the benefit, not of himself, but for the benefit of others. And I just want to...
It's that Philippians 2 thing, man.
Let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus. And it reminded me of this Ellen White quote, and it's one of my favorite Ellen White quotes. It's from Desire of Ages, and I think it really highlights this principle. She says, "Men may exercise power over his human body. They may pierce the holy temples with the crown of thorns. They may strip him of his raiment and quarrel over its division. But they cannot rob him of his power to forgive sins. In dying, he bears testimony to his own divinity and to the glory of the Father. His ear is not heavy that it cannot save, neither his arm shortened that it cannot save. It is his royal right to save unto the uttermost all who come to God by him."
Amen.
And I think that's the picture that I get. Like, they're leading Jesus here, they're leading Jesus there, kangaroo court, injustice, all these kind of things. But what Jesus is accomplishing, what Jesus is leading this whole occasion to, is for the salvation of humanity.
Yeah.
He is in control and he has authority at every single step.
Yeah. It was voluntary.
Yeah.
It was voluntary. I think that's such a really important, good point to make, man. And so, next week we come right to the crucifixion. It's just hard for me to actually sense that this was God and it was for me.
Yeah.
I believe it, but it's so hard to sense it, but that's what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys, for tuning in today. We're looking forward to wrapping this up next week, and we're going to be focusing on the crucifixion and the resurrection. Those two themes are the central pillars of the Christian faith. And so we invite you to join us next week as we look not only at Jesus' death, but also how he conquered the grave. And we look forward to catching you guys then. God bless.